today's talk is quite special and different from how I conduct my earlier talks. My earlier talks are mainly strongly based on political events, Chinese history political events, the founding of dynasties, the fall of dynasties, major battles in ancient China history. But today we will be looking at this topic from a scientific viewpoint. I will be explaining some scientific phenomena so that you have a better appreciation of the subject context that we are dealing with. Today we are dealing with ancient Chinese discoveries and inventions related to astronomy. So some of the things we'll be covering will be calendar making, the observation of eclipse, sunspots, and comets. So these are some of the things we will be discussing about. We will be also touching on some of the instruments they use to make such observations and discoveries. These are the books that I refer to as my main source of reference. Some of these books are right there at the back. So after the program, after today's talk, if you're interested, you can browse through those books and pick them up for borrowing if you are keen. It's a range of materials of different reading levels. This one I'm sure is quite familiar to most of us, the Asia Pac publications. It's a very good introductory reading. It's filled with a lot of pictures in the illustrations and very simple introduction to the topic that we are dealing with. I have a lot of copies of this. This one is quite in the middle, intermediate. So it goes slightly beyond introductory. So if you want to know a bit more, it's a good book. This one is very in-depth. It's a reference book, not for borrowing. It's found at the National Library. This is very good if you want to find out much more in-depth information about the topics that we are covering today. This one there's no specific author. It's a compilation of work from different scientists. Yeah, it's more of a scientific work where it talks about how these ancient Chinese scientists, what methods they use to come up with the theories they have. It's very technical, like when it talks about maths, right? It will talk about the formula, the theory. It's quite in-depth, but it's still a good source. It's still a good source if you want to find out more. But I will recommend these three first before you go into this one. These are the contents. Calendar making, we'll cover that as the first topic, followed by armillary spear. Maybe you have not come across this term. I will talk about that. Astronomical clock, eclipse, sunspots, and comets. The Western scientists in the contemporary world, only until recently, they have always thought that the birth of modern science was mainly a Western product. That is to say that their own civilization, the Greek civilizations, made discoveries in the scientific field, and the modern world, especially the European part of the world, were the ones who went on to act on to those theories and discoveries to give birth to modern science. And they have always thought of the other civilizations as backward, including the Chinese civilization. So this is a comment here by a Western observer in comparison, thinking that the Chinese world paid so much attention to the astronomy, the astronomies of those days, which he felt that is a very barbaric culture. This is what he says. Probably another reason why many Europeans consider the Chinese such barbarians is on the account of the support they give to their astronomers, people regarded by our cultivated Western mortals as completely useless. Now to them, they think that astronomy is about superstitious, so they don't give it high regards. Yet there, they rank with heads of departments and secretaries of the state. What frightful barbarism. It's true that in the Chinese government, astronomers are given high positions. Why is that so? That is because the civilization there are great differences between the Chinese civilization and the Western civilization. Chinese civilization is based mostly on an agrarian society. What does it mean? It places a lot of emphasis on agriculture. Now, the agriculture is the main form of economics for them. For the Western world, it runs slightly different. Okay, for them, their main source and mode of economy is trading, commerce. But for the Chinese, agriculture is important. If the agricultural mode of economy goes down, that's it. The whole nation breaks apart. So for them, that is very important. And for agriculture to be efficient, you need to know the seasons. You need to know when is the good time to harvest, when it's a good time to start to plant your seeds. And that is why the Chinese civilization has always placed so much emphasis on weather and seasons. And the other thing about celestial observation is that it is embedded in the Chinese culture. Chinese culture had believed that the celestial phenomenon, for example, an eclipse or comets, are reflections of the actual world. So an eclipse can be seen as a bad omen, something bad is going to happen to the kingdom. And that's why the Chinese civilization had always been so interested in recording down these phenomena and observing them. Now, much of this ingenious discovery of the Chinese civilization have been long forgotten. Why? Because all this knowledge and information were recorded down in texts that were largely overlooked. Most of the time, the Chinese academics tend to focus on political history. They study what happened to the nation, but they ignore the social aspect of the civilization. So a lot of this information was lost. The Chinese themselves didn't know that they invented something so grand as the astronomical clock, which I'm going to show you later on, until this Westerner, by the name of Joseph Needham. I have one whole talk dedicated to him. So if you're interested, you can go back to my YouTube channel to find out more about this scientist. Joseph Needham is a British chemist. By the chance account, he started to be interested in Chinese science. Some person he knew told him that actually Chinese science is not as backward as he thought. So that sparked his interest and curiosity. He went to China, he did some research. What he did was he dug out all the ancient manuals, the ancient texts, and he read through them carefully. He studied Chinese. He's a Westerner, he studied Chinese, he learned how to read Chinese. So with that knowledge, with the primary source, he went to the original Chinese text, the historical text, to look through. And when he found something that is scientific, he recorded it down and made a catalog. So at the end of the day, he compiled this huge work called The Science and Civilization in China. 7 volumes altogether, still being compiled at this point of time. 2 volumes are not completed yet at this point of time. For him, he mainly compiled the first 3 volumes himself, and the rest of the work he had other assistants to help him. It's a very comprehensive work. It covered things from biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, discoveries of the Chinese civilization. So it's quite amazing that it actually take a foreigner to rediscover the talents of the Chinese civilization. Alright, so much for the background context. Let's look into the astronomy discoveries that we are going to cover today. Now, the first we will be covering is on calendar making. In fact, for today's talk, quite a fair bit of amount of time is allocated for this because I felt that there is a need to explain the scientific context behind it for you to appreciate how these instruments work. Okay, what is a calendar? Very simple question. I'm sure you all have used a calendar. You know that in a calendar year we have 365 days, 12 months. Okay, and each month you may have 30 days or 31 days. Now, but for the calendars, we can mainly classify them into 3 different kinds of calendar. The solar calendar, the lunar, and the combined. Solar is another word for sun, lunar is another word for moon. So that gives you an idea of what these calendars do. Now, the solar calendar is a calendar that tracks the sun movement. So for the Earth, this is where the science portion comes about. Now for the Earth to make one complete round, okay, around the sun, that takes about 365 days. So that's what the solar calendar does. It tracks how long it takes for the Earth to move one orbit around the sun. Now the lunar calendar doesn't focus on the sun's movement, it focuses on the moon's movement. So it tracks when the full moon cycle takes place. Okay, so when is the next full moon? So that's what the lunar calendar tracks. And the combined calendar tracks both. The traditional Chinese calendar is a combined calendar, it tracks both. So that's why on Chinese calendar you have 2 Shu. So that tracks the movement of that tracks the sightings of the moon, when is the next full moon. And the modern day calendar that we use is the Gregorian calendar. It doesn't really track the moon's movement. So on the 1st January, you don't really see a full moon. It doesn't track that. Okay, what it tracks mostly is the 365 days, one cycle around the sun. So what do you need to know when you are making a calendar? 2 very important things. The sun. How fast is the sun moving, right? You need to know that. And also you need to know the moon's movement also, how long it takes for the moon to turn to the next full moon. Okay, but we are not going to talk about the moon today. We are going to focus more on the sun. Now for you to know where is the position of the sun at that point of time in the whole universe, you need to study the position of the sun in respect to the other stars. There is an equipment that allows the scientists to do that, and that is called an armillary sphere, which is called Wenli, which I'll share later on. And also, what you need to know is the position and the speed of the sun. Okay? For a very long time, the astronomers in the past thought that the sun moved. Okay, the right understanding of it is that the sun doesn't move, it's the earth that moves around the sun. But for a very long time, people have always thought it's the sun that moves around the earth. Why? It makes a lot of sense because let's say you are standing here observing the sky, you see the sun move across the sky, right? And you don't feel giddy, you don't feel that the earth is moving. So for a very long time, people have always thought that it's the sun that moves around the earth. Sorry, it's the sun that moves around the earth. That's what people have thought for a very long time. So with that, I will still use terms like the movement of the sun and the velocity of the sun, but just at the back of your head, just bear in mind that it is not the sun that is moving, but it's the earth that is moving. Okay? Yes, so when the sun moves across the sky, there is actually something very different about it at different parts of the year. That is a celestial phenomenon which I will cover later on, and that affects the shadow of the gnomon. The gnomon is a equipment. Many early calendars failed because it was assumed that the speed of the sun is constant. I mentioned earlier on that I want to bring across this point that when the Earth or any other planets move around the sun, it doesn't move in a circle. Okay, I think during my secondary school days, our teachers make it easy. When they draw the grids, right, in the illustration, it seems like a complete circle. It's not that, it doesn't occur that way. In fact, planets move around the sun in an oval, like an oval shape. We call it elliptical orbits around the sun. So that is why at certain parts of the year, the sun appears to move faster. And at certain parts of the year, the sun appears to move slower. It is because of this reason. Okay? It is only the later part of history that the Chinese astronomers have more advanced tools for them to make this observation, that they realize that the sun travels slower after the spring equinox. What's a spring equinox? Later you will see a diagram. And faster after the autumn equinox. Now this is how the planet Earth moves around the sun. This is the sun. And do you notice that the Earth doesn't move in equal distance? It doesn't. Okay, there are certain parts, like here, where it is actually closer to the sun, and here, where it is actually the furthest. So this is a phenomenon that results in our different seasons, in the different positions of the sun when we observe them. This is called the winter solstice, which is our 冬至. Alright? And then there is a summer solstice followed by the equinox. The equinox would be here. And the summer solstice would be here. Okay, I feel that it is important to see the visuals for you to understand the concept of the equinox and the solstice. So this is a video. Now I'm going to play this video for you to see exactly how this works.
Earth is always affected by what is going on out in space. The seasons are changing, but a lot more is happening than the changing of leaves. Seasons are affected by solstices and equinoxes. There is the winter solstice, the vernal equinox, the summer solstice, and the autumnal equinox. A solstice is when the sun in the sky reaches its northernmost or southernmost extremes. This happens because of the Earth's tilt. The summer solstice marks the first day of summer around the 21st of June. On that day in the northern hemisphere, the sun is the highest it ever gets, which results in the summer solstice being the longest day of the year. The northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun, so the sun is located right above the northern continents. But the winter solstice is the opposite. It occurs around the 21st of December, and the sun is very low in the sky. This results in the shortest day of the year because the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. An equinox is different than a solstice. An equinox is when the sun is directly over the equator and the sun is shining on half of the Earth equally. However, most places on Earth aren't seeing exactly 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. Also during an equinox, the Earth's axis isn't tilting towards or away from the sun. There are two equinoxes, the vernal equinox, which occurs at the end of March, and the autumnal equinox, which occurs at the end of September. They work the same way, but the difference is that they occur on different sides of the sun. The vernal equinox is around the start of spring, because after the equinox, the northern hemisphere will be tilting toward the sun, so it'll get warmer. The autumnal equinox is the opposite. The northern hemisphere starts tilting away from the sun around the first day of fall, and it starts to get colder. It was officially fall on September 22nd this year, but the autumnal equinox is on September 23rd because the equinox is actually determined by the placement of the Earth in relation to the sun. So, after the autumnal equinox on the 23rd, we will start seeing more night than day. Back on Earth.
I hope you have a better understanding of the solstice and the equinox. Basically, the equinox is the time, supposedly, in theory, where you have the equal hours for day and night because you have the maximum exposure to the sun. Okay, and during winter solstice, it's the day where the daytime is the shortest and the nighttime is the longest. This is a building, but this is not just a normal building. It's actually a sundial made in the form of building because the higher the sundial can be, the more accurate it is. So during the Yuan dynasty, this astronomer by the name of Jing, which I'll be covering in more details later, was given the task to reform the calendar and make a more accurate calendar. With the resources he had, he rebuilt this observatory. Now this observatory is still standing in China at Henan. How it works is that it is 12.6 meters high, okay? And there's a beam across here, which you cannot really see. So when the sun shines down, it will create a shadow along this ruler here. So this ruler actually allows the observer to measure the length of the shadow. The length of the shadow will be the longest during the winter solstice. Why is that so? I will have a diagram to show you later on. Let's have a look at the video of this observatory.
This 13th century observatory in Henan province is the oldest surviving observatory in China. Even today, when the sun reaches its zenith, rays beam down this central drain.
After the rule of the Yuan dynasty unified China, he wanted to improve the development of agriculture. They want to make the reform of the old calendar so they can know the time when the farmers plant the corn. And every day he measured the shadow of the sun and made some recorder of the changes of the sun. Then according to the recorder, he made out a calendar. The calendar tells us it will take 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes and 12 seconds for the sun to go around the earth.
Okay, now I'm going to explain to you why during winter solstice the shadow length is a bit different. Okay, we have to look at the diagram here to understand. So because of the position of the earth is tilted sideways. It's not vertical like that when it revolves around the sun. So it causes the sun to look different at different parts of the year. This will be a good illustration. Okay? So during winter solstice, the sun, if you observe it in the sky, is actually at the lowest position throughout the whole year. When you look at it across the horizon of the sky. Whereas the equinox is midway between the two. And the summer solstice is the day of the time of the year where the sun's position in relative to the sky is the highest. So these are the different sun positions at the different part of the year. And calendar makers decided to use the winter solstice as a measurement. So how long does it take for me to reach the next winter solstice? That means that is 1 year. So with that, when the sun's position is the lowest, okay, because it is at the lower position, when it shines across the gnomon, we call this the gnomon, which is the object that causes the shadow. Okay, it will result in the longest shadow. But during the summer solstice, because it is higher up, when it shines down, it will create the shortest shadow. So that is how the ancient Chinese measured when is the summer solstice and when is the winter solstice. And when I was researching and reading up on this point, I'm just simply amazed by how observant the Chinese people are at that point of time. And it's just amazing at the thought process that they have already at that point of time, which we would always think that the people in the past are not so scientific as people today, but in fact they have been using instruments like that to measure and to make measurements to make a calendar. That's very amazing to me. So other than using the moment to measure the shadow to decide the winter solstice, I also mentioned that it's important to know the sun's position in relative to where the stars are to make a calendar. So what do they do to make such measurements? This equipment here is called an armillary sphere, 纹仪, which looks like this. It's a ring of circles, okay, in this equipment. And when you move these rings, there are markings on these rings to indicate the positions of the stars. So when you move these rings, you can estimate where are all the positions of all the stars in the sky at this point of time that you are doing the measurement. So it started off with a manual armillary sphere. So one of the earliest recorded armillary sphere is invented by this astronomer during the Western Han Dynasty called Bo Xiaopeng. He is a famous astronomer and mathematician during Han Wudi's time. In fact, he was one of the main contributors to a very important calendar called the Tai Chu Di, which I will cover later on. But this is still not very good because it's manual, you have to turn it by yourself. Later on, Zhang Heng, I'm sure you have heard of him. Zhang Heng is not only famous for creating this device that can detect an earthquake, he refined the Wenyi to be water powered. It becomes an automated armillary sphere. So that means from the point of operation, you don't have to turn it yourself, you just sit down there, watch it. It will show you exactly at point of observation where are the stars in the sky. So according to records, he invented this device, he made a record, he asked somebody to go out to observe the stars, it is correct, 100% accurate. And then there are a lot of efforts later on to improve the armillary sphere. Some of the improvements include things like minimizing the resistance of the rings so that they can move more smoother for greater accuracy. Along the period of history, armillary sphere was developed and refined and became more and more accurate. One of the more famous armillary sphere after Zhang Heng's one is the simplified armillary sphere, the Jianyi. And this is constructed by the same guy who built the tower just now I mentioned, Guo Shoujing of the Yuan Dynasty. And if you want to see the replica of this, it is still here, okay? It is housed in the Zhijinsan Tianwentai in Nanjing. This is a later one, this is a Ming Dynasty replica of an armillary sphere. You can see how complicated and how more refined it is compared to the earlier ones. Okay, you still have this, but it's in the form of replica. I believe all the original ones have been destroyed already during the wartime. This is housed in the Beijing Ancient Observatory, Beijing Wuguan Xiangtai. This is another amazing invention. The astronomical clock, Shui Yun Yixiangtai, and this is invented during the Song Dynasty by this person called Su Song. What is amazing about this is that this is the world's first earliest automated clock, even more detailed than the Zhang Heng's one, because you can actually tell time, month, year. You can also tell the stars constellation, and also it has this mechanism of mannequins which will appear at the right time to strike the gongs or the drums or the bells to show time. So it's quite amazing that something like that was already invented so much earlier. In fact, this is so sophisticated that a lot of modern scientists can't believe that it could be built at that point of time because of the level of sophistication. I'm going to show a video of how this astronomical clock looks like. First, I have some photos. Yes, this is how it looks like. It's driven mostly, powered mostly by a water wheel inside. So the mechanism to drive it is the flow of water. Okay, so from there is a lot of details here which I think you can't really see. This is the armillary sphere. There's an armillary sphere right on top. Okay? And these are the mechanisms to tell time, year, and month. There's a replica now. It's housed in the Hong'an 科技馆 in Xiamen. If you are keen, you can go and have a look at how it looks like. Let's have a video of how this clock looks like.
Ancient China was not only responsible for developing industrial machines and practices, for there was one inventor during the Song dynasty who created a machine that is nothing short of stunning. This machine was to cement China's reputation as being at the forefront of ancient technology. It was known as the cosmic engine, the ancient world's astronomical computer. Although the inventors of ancient China developed a vast range of mind-boggling technologies, there is one invention that stands alone as the embodiment of Chinese expertise in science and engineering. And as was the case with the Romans and the Greeks, it was built by a Chinese innovator who was way ahead of his time. A master of precision technology and a brilliant all-round engineer, his name was Su Song. Su Song's most amazing invention was so complicated that for centuries its workings were an enigma to engineers and scholars. It was simply called the cosmic engine. In effect, a huge, water-controlled astronomical cosmic computer. It was such an incredible feat of engineering and scientific knowledge that few Westerners believed it could have existed.
Su Song's water-driven cosmic engine was created in 1092 AD. It was considered to be one of the most splendid achievements in the history of ancient Chinese inventions.
Su Song's complex mechanism was designed to calculate time, not just hours and minutes, but weeks, months, and seasons. The ancient Chinese understood that the calendar reflects the way the Earth moves around the sun. But what makes this machine truly stand apart is that the cosmic engine also calculated the way the Earth and planets move through space. Furthermore, the ancient Chinese believed that the movements of the stars were closely related to the destiny of the country and its rulers. This machine was not only to calculate the passage of the stars and the Earth in order to tell time, it was to reveal to the world the technological sophistication of China. This was a monumental task. How did Su Song realize such an ambition?
The cosmic engine is a huge 12-meter tall apparatus and very complicated inside. It includes 4 major systems built up by more than 400 parts. It is a masterpiece of mechanical design and manufacturing.
Today, we know exactly how this mechanism was built because Su Song left us detailed blueprints in his treatise called A New Design for a Mechanized Armillary Sphere and Celestial Globe. The book was written 900 years ago.
This book is very precious to us today. It gives us the original blueprint, so researchers can clearly see the configuration of this ancient apparatus. The script contains 47 illustrations. These include all the parts and their assemblage.
The Science and Technology Museum in Beijing, using the machine's original blueprint, has built a fully accurate reconstruction. The computer looked like a tower. The whole mechanism was 5 stories tall. The front of the tower was a pagoda structure, with each of the 5 stories having a door through which mannequins appeared, ringing bells and gongs and holding tablets to indicate the hours and other times of the day and night. But how did it work? What ingenious innovations and technological developments were involved? a celestial globe showing the movement of the stars inside the tower turned in synchronization with a sphere just above it. As the celestial globe turns, so does the sphere. This meant that the analysts and engineers using the computer could compare and cross-reference between both globes and record multiple data. All of the time indicators were controlled by the same giant machinery that simultaneously turned the sphere and the globe. Within the mechanism is the earliest example of an escapement in a machine, a concept essential to modern mechanical clockwork. In any form of clock-based machinery, power must be delivered to the mechanism in a precise fashion that can be accurately regulated. The rationing of power is the function of this escapement and is something Susong successfully achieved. Susong included a cogged wheel in the system. Connected to this was a stopper that only allowed the cog to rotate at a specific rate. By stopping the rotation briefly and then allowing it to continue at a precise, regular frequency. It is this ingenious system that allowed the invention of Western clocks centuries later. And in fact, it is the periodic stopping and releasing of the escapement that causes the ticking sound of any clock or timer today. Another ingenious aspect to the cosmic engine was its power source, a great scoop wheel using water and turning all the shafts, working the various devices. This ancient super machine ran from the 11th century until it was destroyed by political enemies of the Song dynasty. The cosmic engine is considered by some scholars to be the greatest mechanical achievement of the Middle Ages anywhere in the world.
So we continue history of the Chinese calendar. So after exploring the different devices and equipments used to calculate time, we're going to look at the development of the Chinese calendars. Okay. This is a brief chart of what were the different calendars used at different points of time. Today we are mainly dealing with the very early one, the Zhuanxu, okay, the Tai Chu, and the one by Guo Shoujing, which is the Shou Shi. Okay, we are mainly going to cover these three. So calendars have been around for a very long time according to Chinese legend. It was invented during antiquity times, during the legendary days of the Yellow Emperor. Many calendars were adopted throughout the course of Chinese history. And during the early years, referring to the Western Han Dynasty, people used this calendar called the Zhuanxu. This was believed to be devised during the Qin Dynasty. And for this calendar, what is the characteristic of this calendar? This calendar is troublesome. It's problematic. Why? But it is accurate. It's problematic because it doesn't give you 12 months in a year every year. What happens is that people of that time, the astronomers, they realized that in 19 years, there's exactly 235 months. Okay? So for you to work out this maths, that means during these 19 years, this period of 19 years, there will be 7 years out of these 19 years where you add one more month. So it's very confusing, right? I mean, it will be easy if you say every even year you add a month, but every 19 years you add 1 month to 7 of the years of the 19 months, how to keep track? Very complicated. So it wasn't that useful for people later on. They realized it's troublesome. And for this calendar, it calculated that 1 year there is 365.25 days. During Han Wudi's time, Han Wudi realized this calendar cannot make it not accurate. Every time I try to use this to tell me when is the season coming, it's not telling me accurately. So it's time for a better calendar. So he gathered his officials, give them a task, complete and make a better calendar. And this person, which I mentioned earlier on, who is responsible for the armillary spear, was Luo Xiang. He was one of the key officials who developed this Tai Chu Li, and he made refinements. Okay? And what they calculated is that 1 year is not 365.25, 1 year is 365.2502. So later on you see more and more decimals, okay? And then a month is actually 29.530860 to account for the difference. Right? And then one of the most ingenious aspect of this calendar is that it included the 24季节, 24 solar terms. Okay, in the earlier calendars, no such thing. The earlier calendars were useful to predict when is the next full moon. Okay, so it's not very helpful to the farmers. And farmers aren't concerned about the full moon. They want to know when is the time for me to harvest my crop. Lord Xiaohong realized this need to be addressed, and he added this feature into his new calendar. Let's look at what the 24季节 means, 24 solar terms. This is 24 solar terms. It divides a month into 2 periods, and each period represents something. For example, the first month, the first 2 weeks, okay, you will be the Li Chun. That means the spring begins and it turns warm. And then, for example, on the 3rd month, the first 2 weeks will be Qingming. What does it refer to? It means that you expect a warm weather, and the weather is clear and bright. This is how the solar terms come into play. And with this cycle, with this information, it becomes a much more useful calendar for the farmers. This Tai Chu Li was considered to be one of the most significant Chinese calendar throughout the whole history of China because of the introduction of this 24 solar terms. What are the other Chinese calendars formulated? We have the Lin De Li compiled by Li Chunfeng, and you have the Da Yan Li by the monk Yi Xing Canshi. These both calendars were made during the Tang Dynasty. The main differences will be the further refinements to how many days there are in the year, how many days there are in a month. But all these calendars were only used briefly because it was realized again that they were not very accurate. Why were they not very accurate? I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk that the astronomers of that time didn't realize that the sun doesn't move at a different speed during different parts of the year. They have assumed that it moves at the same speed, which resulted in this miscalculation. The most famous calendar that we are going to cover would be the 授时历, invented by Guo Shoujing. He's an astronomer. He was an astronomer during the Yuan Dynasty, and this 授时历 was so important and so famous that it was used for a very long time. It was used for more than 360 years, and it became the best representative, other than the Tai Chu Li, of ancient Chinese calendars. And this calendar drew attention lately. A lot of modern scientists have been trying to study more about this calendar. Let's take a look at the background of this 授时历. So in 1276, Kublai Khan, the leader of the Yuan Dynasty, is the first emperor, assigned Guo Shoujing to make a new calendar. Why? Because as usual, the previous earlier calendars were all inaccurate. So there's a need to have a better refined calendar. Guo Shoujing is a very scientific man. He realized that for him to make a good calendar, he needs to have good observations, and good observations come from good instruments. That's a very scientific view of phenomena. So he spent about 3 years to create better armillary spheres and better devices, including the tower that I showed you earlier on, okay, to measure these phenomena. Some of the things he built is the Jianyi, simplified armillary sphere. The Yangyi is another kind of sphere, and another water-powered armillary sphere called the Linglongyi to make more accurate measurements. And he did these measurements at 27 different locations to make sure that these measurements are accurate. So what did he work out? He worked out that the year is 365.24 25 is not 25. That's what you realize. 365.2425 days in a year, and a month there is 29.530593 days in a month. And this will be the most accurate calendar we can ever devise, because currently our Gregorian calendar that we use now also use these days, and for a year, to measure a year and to measure a month is also this same number of days. And what is amazing is that this calendar predated the Gregorian calendar by 300 years. It's quite accurate already, because this measurement only differs from the actual time by 26 seconds. Astronomers in the United States, Japan, and other countries recently had a renewed interest in this calendar. So they've been digging out this calendar and studying it. And to honor Guo Shoujing's contribution, a crater on the moon is named after him, Guo Shoujing crater. After the invention, I believe that the calendar was adopted also by other countries. Japan, Korea, they adopted this calendar and used it also. And Vietnam. Okay, that's something new. Okay, thanks for sharing. Eclipse. So what is a solar eclipse? These are phenomena due to the movements of the moon and the earth. For the solar eclipse, it happens when the moon happens to move between the sun and the earth. So the moon blocks the sun, and it looks like the sun is being eaten up. The lunar eclipse is another phenomenon where this time around it is the earth that blocks the sun from shining on the moon. The moon shines at night not because the moon has light itself, okay? It's because the sun shines on the moon and reflects the light back on Earth. That's why we see the moon to be shining. And when the lunar eclipse happens, it will make the moon to have a reddish appearance. How early are the records of these eclipses? The ancient Chinese, they are fascinated with celestial phenomenon, as I mentioned, and they made very fine, detailed observations of these phenomena. Altogether, in the Chinese text, we can see up to 596 solar eclipses and 2,000 lunar eclipses being recorded. And what is amazing is that the earliest record of a solar eclipse was found on auricle shells, which are bones and tortoise shells, and the Yin runes, that means the Shang period, dating 1200 BC. And this is more than 600 years earlier than the first record in Europe. As for the lunar eclipse, the earliest was found in the Book of Songs, and this lunar eclipse occurred roughly around in 776 BC. And this is said to be the earliest record of the lunar eclipse in the whole world, earlier than other civilizations. And people at that time were already quite scientific. Zhang Heng already knew that the moon shines at night because of the reflection of the sun. He was able to explain that the lunar eclipse happened because the earth moves between the sun and the moon, blocking the light. That is why there is a lunar eclipse. And the ancient Chinese astronomers were able to work out these cycles. Every 716 months, you will see a solar eclipse. And it is so accurate to the point of time that they will announce to the city that today there will be an eclipse. All of you can go home and observe. What do? You go home, you take a basin of water, and you observe the solar eclipse because of the reflection in the water, so you can see the whole process. You cannot look at the sun directly, you will blind your eye. Okay, so you have to look in through an indirect way. I think this is quite ingenious of them to think of this method. So that is eclipse. Let's look at sunspots. So what are sunspots? I think we will not be familiar with this occurrence because First of all, we can't look at the sun. Okay, so most of the time we will not be aware that there's this thing that's ongoing. A sunspot basically are spots, black spots like that, that will appear on the surface of the sun. So how and why does it happen is because of the forces on the sun that traps the light. So that means at these areas the light got sucked down, so it cannot escape to the earth. That's why you will see a black spot here. So this is a video.
At Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona, solar astronomer Matt Penn studies this solar surface to discover how photons of light get trapped.
There's a bunch of cirrus today, but hopefully we'll get some data.
Using the McNath Pierce telescope, he focuses the sun's light to scan the photosphere in detail.
So what we've got are a few small sunspots on the disk of the sun. We've got two sunspots, two large ones. They're heading off to the edge of the sun, to the limb of the sun, but they're all accompanied by smaller sunspots, groups of smaller ones following them.
Sunspots mark areas where light is trapped.
So a sunspot forms a dark spot by removing energy from that part of the sun. It's blocking the convective flows that transport the heat and the light from inside the sun to space. And so what we see then is a cooler region that appears dark to us.
A powerful force stops our photon dead in its tracks, preventing its light and energy from leaving the sun's surface. That force is magnetism. Sunspots take shape where intense magnetism from deep inside the sun blasts up through the photosphere.
The magnetic fields are so strong that it actually stops the convective motion of hot inner material from flowing to the surface. So you actually get what looks like a cool spot on the surface of the sun.
They can be huge, the largest over 10 times the size of Earth.
So like I said just now, that you can't observe with your naked eye. So how did the ancient Chinese observe this? I will cover that later on. The earliest record of sunspots was found in Huainanzi around, which is compiled around 140 BC. It was said that they described the appearance of a crow in the center of the sun, which scientists believe it meant that there was a sunspot that's like in the shape of a crow being observed. And up to 17th century, more than 100 sunspot accounts have been recorded in Chinese texts. And the detail goes to the extent of recording how long did this sunspot occur and what was the shape. So how did the Chinese observe the sunspot? Two ways. If you are lucky, it happened that day that there's a mist or the cloud was there, you can see the sunspot because the light from the sun is not as bright. Or the other better way is you take a basin with oil and observe it. The image of the sun will be reflected. So that's how they observe sunspots without directly looking at it. And what's the impact of this? Very important. Why? Because modern astronomers studied sunspots and realized that every 11 years there will be certain sunspots appearing on the sun. But for scientific theories to be proven, you need to make repeated tests. Is it only this time that it happens to be that this 11 years it happened, but earlier on no? So this is where the Chinese records played a valuable role. It acted as evidence to prove that yes, it is right. So according to the historical text, it is true, there's an 11-year cycle. So from 43 BC to 1638 AD, yes, there's this pattern that every 11 years there will be sunspots on the sun. And this was very important evidence for this modern scientific theory. And from here we can see how ancient Chinese records can be used even today to prove modern science theory. Comments? comets are 扫把星 in Chinese. Comets are actually objects in the solar system made of ice and rock that will orbit around the sun also, like a planet. It will turn and orbit around the sun. And when it gets near to the sun, because of the ice on it, the ice melts and forms gas, forming this sighting that we see, the long tail. In Chinese culture, it's commonly known as the 扫把星, and you use 扫把星to refer to a person as a jinx, because it is believed to be a bad sign in Chinese culture that symbolizes war and calamity. Halley's Comet. In 1682, a British astronomer, Edmund Halley, discovered that this comet moved in a similar orbit that were recorded in 1531 and 1607. So he predicted that there's a cycle to it. The comet will return 76 years later. In fact, yes, 76 years later, the comet did return as predicted. That is why it was named as Halley's Comet. I mentioned this comet because this comet was really observed during early China history. Comets have been mentioned in Chinese documents at least 500 times, and one of the earliest records was the sighting of the Halley's Comet in 613 BC, recorded in this history document called the Spring and Autumn Annals. This was the entire world's earliest record of Halley's Comet. In terms of sightings of comets, like the other sightings, it is very detailed. You will note the shape, the color, the times of appearance, position, direction, and also they also recorded sightings of comets splitting. The shapes, the colors, the time and of appearance and the position, I will show you an example. Don't need to exactly know what these star constellations are. These are just different star constellations to tell the observer where this comet appeared in the sky. From this account, you can see how detailed it is and how interesting it is in their description. Let's look at it. In Han, they recorded a sighting of a comet in 12 BC. They tell you the time of the occurrence. On the 12th of the 7th month, in the first year of the reign of Yan Yuan, a star first appeared in the Dongjing constellation. Don't need to know what these are, just know that they are star constellations. Then traveled past Wuzhuhou and the region north of Heshu. It was seen successively in Xuanyuan and the enclosure Taipei, and was 6 degrees behind the sun. Can even tell you 6 degrees behind the sun when it appeared east in the morning. On the 13th, so this person nothing better to do. On the 12th and 13th also sit there and observe. On the 13th, it was seen in the west after sunset. Its tail was again in the enclosure Ziwei. It headed south at the same longitudes as Tajiao and Nieti. It slowed down. I can tell you it slowed down. It slowed down when it reached the enclosure Tianshu with its tail in the center of that group of stars. 10 days later, it flew westward, and after 56 days, it disappeared along Changlong of the ecliptic. This person observed for 56 days. That's a good job. I wish I can do a job like that, just observe. Right, so that's the detail of the record. Can tell you when it starts, when it ends, where it is, how slow, how fast it is. And there's a record of the splitting of the comet also. I like the description, very interesting. In the 10th month of the AD 897, in this book called The New History of Tang Dynasty, Xin Kangshu recorded 3 stars, 3 traveling stars, one bigger than the other, were seen. They traveled together eastwards, now close to each other, and then further apart, as if engaged in a fight. I like the description. 3 days later, the big star vanished, and then the other 2. So modern scientists, when they look at this description, they realize, oh, this is actually a record about the splitting of the comet. Some comets, when they move, they split, actually, from 1 into 2, or into more than that. So this is a record of that. Same as well, this one was also used, these sightings were also used for modern scientific theories. especially in the Hades comet. For example, 1970s, this scientist by the name of Joseph L. Reddy made use of the ancient Chinese information, the records of the Hades sightings in his research to prove and predict Hades comet's movement. Another Chinese astronomer Zhang Yuce published a paper in 1978 also citing data from Chinese historical writings and used those data input into the computer to determine the orbital elements of the Hades comet's appearances. So amazing that things in the past could influence things now. So these are all the celestial phenomena that I covered for today. Let's go into the conclusion. In fact, it's quite different from what we thought. The state of and development of ancient Chinese science and technology was very advanced at that point of time. And the ancient world is not as backward as we may thought. And we have to start to relook at the modern science as a science that is not just a product of the Western world, but a product of different various civilizations. Not just the Chinese civilization, but the Arab civilization as well, because I understand that the Arabs were also very advanced in science. In fact, they contributed a lot to the physics of optics, that means the study of the light, the movement of light. So we have to relook and we need to appreciate the contribution and achievements of the various ancient civilizations.